Around 1990, the Famicom's life cycle was beginning to come to an end. In the US, Europe, and its home country of Japan, Nintendo was ready to make the transition from 8 bits to 16 bits with their new Super Famicom console. However, in countries like China, this transition never occurred. In fact, still to this day, the Famicom is in some sense just as popular as ever. This is because of two major things. The first being the Chinese economy, which would make buying the new console quite difficult. In fact, most people who owned a Famicom had a bootleg, cheaply made imitation, referred to as a Famiclone. But probably what contributed most was the ban on video game consoles, which was instituted by the Chinese government in 2000. Because of these things, gamers in China were pretty much forced to turn to piracy if they wanted to play a certain game. And so we come to the topic of today's video, Super Mario World for the Famicom. Super Mario World was originally released on the Super Famicom as one of its debut titles, and has since been lauded as one of the best on the console for taking everything that made its predecessor great and making it all that more super. Today we'll look at a demake of that game. For the uninitiated, a demake is a game which is ported backwards from a more powerful system to a more primitive one. Through piracy, a lot of games got this treatment, such as The Legend of Zelda: A Link to the Past, Final Fantasy VII, and of course Super Mario World. But now that we've established some background information, let's get into the review. The game begins off, unsurprisingly, with a title screen, as you are given the option of 1 or 2 players. All the while, an 8-bit version of the iconic Super Mario World theme is playing in the background. It really amazes me how well they ported the music, and all the sound effects for that matter. After you make your selection, that is assuming that you did make one and aren't going to endlessly stare at the title screen, you're brought to the overworld map. You can't move, so you're forced to select the first area, which in the Super Nintendo version was known as Yoshi's house. There isn't much of anything here, and it seems to serve only as a way to familiarize yourself with the controls. This is actually quite helpful though, because the way Mario controls is just weird. He moves really fast for some reason, making him in some regards feel more like Sonic the Hedgehog than Mario. He also has extremely awkward jump physics. You don't really feel in control of Mario. It's as if he could land anywhere. Sometimes he jumps short or sometimes he jumps unpredictably far. And considering that this game's a platformer, this can result in some really cheap deaths. But perhaps I'm getting ahead of myself. Let's take a look at the first level of the game. As those of you familiar with Super Mario World may notice, the levels are extremely faithful to their Super Famicom counterparts. Minus the music, that is. Which, while fitting, isn't from the levels they are trying to emulate oftentimes. All the graphics and placement of objects, though, are rather superb. However, nice visuals does not a good game make. The question is the game fun? Well, yes and no. As I mentioned earlier, the controls are all messed up, and this really puts a hamper on the experience for a good 30 minutes until you get used to them. At least 75% of the times when I died during this game, it was due to poor controls, especially when jumping over pits. Another complaint I have, though much more minor, has to do with the bosses in this game, of which there are 4. 2 are the Koopa Kids, and the other 2 are the Resnors, which are the mini-bosses from the Super Famicom version. There's absolutely no difference between the 2 Resnor fights, and considering that one of them is actually the final boss of the game, it's all really anticlimactic. Actually, speaking of anticlimactic, take a look at this ending. Though I guess I shouldn't have expected too much from a pirated game. However, other than that and a few other very minor things, like the fact that Mario runs uphill faster than he does downhill, and that when you bump into blocks they don't appear to be hit, it's Super Mario World. All the power-ups are here, all the memorable enemies and environments. The fun is here if you're willing to spend the time to find it. For a fan of the game, it's definitely something worth looking into, and if you're interested, I even hear there's one version of the game with new bosses and more levels, though I've never come across it in my searches, so happy hunting. For those of you who are unfamiliar with the original Mario World though, it's best to play that one first, so you can truly appreciate this one. My final verdict on it is that given all the circumstances, this game is truly wonderful, and one that never ceases to fascinate me in some capacity. And I'm not entirely sure why that is. Perhaps it has something to do with its origin or just my love for the Super Famicom version. Who knows? Either way, this game comes mostly recommended.